Hello everyone, in this episode I'm going to talk about custom authentication for Blazor WebAssembly applications. We can add authentication support when we create Blazor WebAssembly applications, and Blazor creates database tables for us so that we can store users, its roles, its claims. It also creates pages for us so that we can register and log in user, and it also maintains the state of the user so that when you log in the user stays logged in. When you log out the user stays logged out. So Blazor does that heavy lifting for us. But what if we don't want that? We want to design our own database tables. We want to design our own login and logout pages, and we want to maintain the state of the user using our own default scheme. For that, I'm gonna follow this approach. Blazing Chat is ASP.NET Core hosted site. That means it has two projects. One is client, another is server. We're gonna need to enable authentication on both of these projects. Once you're done with that, then we're gonna need to add three web API call. One is to sign in the user, another is to sign out the user, and the third one is to get the current state of the user. If the user is signed in, then it's going to return the user which is signed in. If the user is signed out, then it's going to return empty user back to the client. Once we are done with that, then we're going to need an interface on the client side so that we can send the email address and the password to the server. So the server can validate those details and see if the user is valid or not. And if the user is valid, then it's going to sign in the user and send the user back to the client. If you click on logout button, it's going to call this web API so that it can log out the user on the server side. We are also going to need authentication state provider so that even if the user refreshes the page or navigates between the component, it can either get the state of the user from the server side or from the client side. Let's first understand how I have set up this login page, and then we'll enable custom authentication in our Blazing Chat application. The login page is pretty typical. It's asking for email address and password, and it has this login button. If I click on it, it goes to the profile page. It doesn't authenticate the user, it just navigates to the profile page. Let's check out its code. For that, I'm going to go to my Razor component here, and here I'm injecting login view model. Just like we injected view models for other pages, I'm injecting login view model here. And login view model has email address and password, and it also has login user method, which gets called whenever we click on this login button. So if I go to my login view model, it doesn't really do anything on the login method. Here, just waiting for a second. We're going to change this method so that we can actually authenticate the user into the system. Once it's done calling that method, it's navigating to the profile page, and I have set the force load flag to true. That means it refreshes the page whenever you land on the profile page. I'll explain why we are doing this later in the video. I also added two panels here. One says hello email address or username and the logout button, and another panel just says login button. So whenever user is logged in, I want to show this message. I want to show their email address and say hello, and the logout button so that they can get out of the system. And if the user is not logged in, then I want to show this button so that they can click on this button and go to the login page and log in into the system. So for that, I have added some code in my main layout. If I go to the main layout, I have added the hello message and a button, a logout button, which calls logout user, but currently it's just navigating to the login page. And same is happening on the login user. We're gonna change this code so that user can log in and log out of the system. And the last thing that we talked about in our slides is we're gonna need three web API calls so that we can sign in, sign out, and get the current state of the user. For that, I've just written those methods. I've not really added authentication code in them. I have just written those web API calls, which are not really doing anything. It's just login user, logout user, and get the current user. They're just like creating new instance of user and sending it back to the client. But we're gonna change this method so that we can log in the user on the server, log out the user, and get the current state so that we can maintain the state of the user on the server side. So that's what we're going to do in the next section. We're going to add authentication support on the server side and the client side so that we can log in our user into the system. First, I'm going to go ahead and add authentication in my server project. For that, I'm going to go to its startup class. And in its startup class, I have configure services and configure methods. In configure method, I'm going to tell my app to use authentication. So that's going to be the first thing that I'm going to do. And if I hover over this method, it says it adds authentication middleware to the specified application builder, which enables authentication capabilities. Once you're done with that, then you're going to have to tell your server which authentication scheme it should use for maintaining state of the user. For that, I'm going to go to my configure services, and first I'm going to add authentication support. So I'm going to say services.add authentication support, and in authentication support, I can mention what authentication scheme I can use. So I'm going to say options is equal to, we would like to mention the default scheme for our options, and I'm gonna use cookie authentication for maintaining the state of the user, but you could use any other scheme that you like. So I'm gonna copy cookie authentication from my notepad and paste it here. It's gonna throw an error because we don't have this namespace in our file, so I'm gonna hit Control dot and get that namespace in my file. And that's all you need to do on the server side to enable authentication. Now in the controllers, you can call HTTP context sign in async to log in a user, and to log out the user, you'll have to call HTTP context dot sign out async. Let's go ahead and add authentication support in our client project. So the very first thing that I'm going to do is grab this NuGet package. The NuGet package name is Microsoft ASP.NET Core Components Authorization. I'm going to mention this link in the video description. I'm going to grab this package reference and go to my client project and add that package reference in my project file. Once you're done with that, then you're going to have to tell your client application to add that support through program.cs. So I'm gonna go to my program.cs, and in the main function, I'm gonna tell my builder to add some services. The first service is going to be add options, and the second service is going to be authorization core. So I'm gonna say add authorization core. And that's all you need to do in order to enable authentication for your client project. But we're going to need authentication state providers so that whenever user refreshes the page, it could get the state of the user from the server. For that, let's go ahead and add that class. I'm going to go to my client project and add a class which is going to be custom authentication state provider.cs. And this class will give you the state of the user. So I'm gonna grab the class structure, I'm gonna paste it here, and this is an empty class. It doesn't have anything. I just added namespaces so that it could use some of the classes pretty easily in this class. This class is going to inherit from authentication state provider. So I'm gonna copy this text and tell it to inherit from this class. If I hover over this class, it is coming from Microsoft ASP.NET Core Components Authorization Package that we just added. It's gonna throw an error because we need to implement this abstract class. So I'm gonna hit Control dot and implement that abstract class, and it's going to create this get authentication state async method, which is going to get the state of the user. Okay, so I'm gonna have to add this class in my services. So I'm gonna go to my program.cs, and I'm gonna have to tell my builder will have to add a scoped service, which is going to be type of custom authentication state provider. Just like we added the abstract class and then the concrete class, let's go ahead and do the same thing for the authentication state provider, so that in the future, if you want to change the custom authentication state provider, you can pretty easily do that. So I'm gonna add this class as a service in my client project. It's gonna throw an error because it doesn't have that namespace. So I'm gonna add that namespace in my file. So that's all you need to do to enable authentication on the client side and on the server side. Now we can go to our server side, and in the controllers, we can take users information and check if the user is valid or not, and then sign in the user. And whenever user logs out by clicking on a button on the client side, we can call a web API which could call HTTP context sign out async to sign out that user from the server. To implement these methods, I'm going to go to my server application, and in the server project, I'm going to go to my user controller, and here I have these three methods. One is login user, another is logout user, and the third one is get current user. So first, we would like to validate the user which is coming from the client. And if the user is valid, then we want to sign in that user on the server side. So let's first check if the user exists in our database or not. For that, I'm going to use DB context, and I'm going to check if the user exists or not, and by its email address and password. So I'm going to say u dot email address is equal to user's email address, and u dot password matches with the user's password. And this is not the most secure way of sending the username and password of the user, but that's not the point of this video. The point of the video is to make sure that you can authenticate user and maintain state of the user. We'll make this secure as we progress in the video series, but in this video, I'm not going to worry about that. So I'm going to add await keyword so that we can call this async method. And once we have the user from our database, once the user is valid, then I'm going to check if the user is not null. And then we would like to sign in that user in our server application. For that, first we will have to create a claim, and then we will have to create claims identity, and then we'll have to create claims principal, and then we will have to use that claims principal to sign in the user. I'm going to say sign in user. So let's go ahead and create the claim. For creating a claim, we're going to need something from our user. So I'm going to say claim is equal to new claim, and we'll have to bring in a namespace, which is going to be system.securityClaims. And here we're going to need the claims type. The claims type that I'm going to use is name, but you could use anything. It's easier to access name from the client side, so I'm going to use name here. And in name, I'm going to store user's email address so that it looks nicer on the client side. Once you're done creating the claim, you can create claims identity. So let's go ahead and do that. So I'm going to say var claims identity is equal to new claims identity, and claims identity takes claims as INumerable, and it also takes authentication type. So I'm gonna pass claims first, which is going to be array, and in which I'm just gonna pass one claim that we created, and the authentication type, which is a string property, I'm gonna set it to server auth. Once we have the claims identity, it's easy to create claim principal. So I'm gonna create claims principal, which is going to be new claims principal. And here I'm gonna pass claims identity in it. Once we have claim principal, then I can sign in user on the server side. So for that, I'm going to use HTTP context, and I have this method which is sign in async. We'll have to bring in a namespace for this. So I'm gonna hit control dot, not control comma, and add this namespace in my file. In sign in async, we'll have to pass claims principal as parameter so that we can sign in our user, our logged in user in the server. This is gonna throw a warning, but we can fix that by inserting an await keyword. Sweet. So let's go ahead and call this web API from the client side. So whenever I click on this login button, I would like to call this web API. For that, I'm going to go to my client project and find my login page. Login page calls login view model. So I'm going to go to login view model. And in login view model, instead of just waiting for a second, let's go ahead and call that web API. So calling that web API, I'm going to use HTTP client and use post as JSON async. Here I'm going to pass user from the client, and the address of our controller is going to be user login user. And here I'm going to pass this. See, this is login view model, but we used operators to convert our login view model into user. And this is something that we covered in our MVVM architecture. So if you haven't seen those videos, I recommend that you watch those videos. So now we are calling this web API from our login button, and that is going to sign in the user in the system. There is this one thing that I forgot to do in my last section. That was, I forgot to mention to add cookie in my add authentication method. So we want to tell our server to add a cookie so that it could use it for maintaining the state of the user. Let's run this and see how it looks. Now, before I click on the login button, I'm gonna open my developer tools and go to cookies. And here I have selected my website. And in the application, you can see that there are no cookies right now. But I'm gonna click on this login button and pass valid username and password. And it adds a cookie which it uses to maintain the state of the user. That's how sign-in happens on the server side. Now we need to get the current state of the user. We did manage to sign in the user on the server side. Now we're gonna need to get the current state of the user. For that, I'm gonna go to my user controller, and I'm gonna get the current state of the user by calling this web API. So if you want to find if the user is valid or not, you can do that by checking if user.identity.isAuthenticated flag. So if the user is valid, you can get the information of that user from its claims. So what I'm going to do, instead of sending just new instance of the user, whenever this web API gets called, I would like to send the user with the email address that we saved as claims. So I'm going to set current user's email address is going to be email address of from the claims. So I'm going to set the claims type as names. As name, because that's where we stored the email address. Let's run this and see if we could get the current state of the user or not. So now if I refresh the page, the user is already logged in. I'm gonna go ahead and call that web API, this get current user web API. Here I'm gonna say user / get current user. And when I call that web API, it gives me the email address of the user that we signed in from its claims. So that's how you can get the current state of the user. That's how you can get the current state of the user. So now we're done with logging in the user, getting the current state of the user. Let's go ahead and sign out the user. Signing out is pretty easy. I'm gonna go to my logout method, and here, instead of just waiting for a second, I'm gonna use HTTP context and call sign out async. And that's all you need to do to sign out the user from your system. Let's read on this. Okay, so I'm going to refresh the page again. I still have the cookie. I'm going to refresh get current user. I still have that user. Now I'm going to call this logout web API. So I'm going to go to user and say logout user web API. It returns success. Now if I refresh this web API, this John Smith will be null because the user is logged out. And if I refresh this web app, then I don't have any cookies stored to maintain the state of the user. So that's how you can implement sign in the user, log out the user, and get the current state of the user. In the next section, we're gonna work on authentication state provider so that we can show some of the components depending on the state of the user which is maintained on the client side. We added authentication state provider when we enabled authentication on the client side. It had us implement this get authentication state async method, which returns authentication state. That means this method is responsible for getting the current state of the user, and it gets called when you load your application for the first time or if you reload or refresh your page. So we need to sync up with server's authentication state by calling get current user in our get authentication state async method. So we're going to need HTTP client for that. Make sure that you have HTTP client is added as a transient service in program.cs so that we could inject that in our custom authentication state provider. So I already have that. I'm going to get that in my local variable. So I'm going to say private. I say private read only HTTP client underscore HTTP client. And we need to inject the HTTP client, which is added as a service from our program.cs. So to inject that, I'm gonna inject it in my constructor. I'm gonna say custom authentication state provider. And here, I would like to inject HTTP client. And I'm gonna assign it to HTTP client, which is our local variable. So now we have HTTP client that we could use for calling web API. I'm gonna get rid of this line, and instead of that, I'm gonna catch user from by calling get current user. So I'm gonna say user current user is equal to underscore HTTP client get from JSON async. We are expecting user, and we would like to call our user get current user. Nice. This is gonna throw error because we need to add an async keyword here and an await keyword here. The method is still throwing error because it's expecting authentication state, and we can fill that authentication state when we know if the user is logged in or not. So first check if the user is logged in or not. So I'm gonna say current user is not null, and the current user dot email address is also null. Once we know that user is logged in on the server side, we need claims principal so that we could create authentication state and send it back through this method. For that, I'm going to copy some code from my server. When we logged in, we created claims identity, and claims principal. I'm going to copy that code and paste it here. But instead of using logged in user, I'm going to use current user. And now I have the claims principal that I can use for creating authentication state, and we could send it back through this method. For that, I'm going to say return new authentication state, in which I'm going to pass claims principal here. Nice. But if the user is logged out, then we want to send an empty authentication state. For that, I'm going to say get authentication state. And here I want to pass new claims principal, which is empty, which also expects a new claims identity, which is also empty, so that it knows that the user is not logged in on the server side, and we would like to send an empty authentication state so that so that our client application knows if the user is logged in or not. So that's all you need to do on the custom authentication state provider. Now we need to tell our app that it can expect authentication state as cascading parameter. So we'll need to wrap our router around cascading authentication state. For that, I'm gonna use a package which is going to make Microsoft ASP.NET Core components.authorization. And then I can wrap my router around this cascading authentication state. Let's make it look a little nicer. So I'm gonna hit tab here, and then we're gonna also need to change this route view. This route view is going to be authorize route view. authorized route view, so that it can take the cascading authentication state as parameter. We are going to need this namespace across our application, so I'm gonna cut this and put it in the imports.razor with other namespaces so that I could use the components from that package. Once we are done with app.razor, now in the beginning of the video, I mentioned that I want to show this component when user is logged in, and this panel when user is logged out. For that, I'm gonna go to my main layout, and here I can use authorized view, authorized component, and non-authorized component to manipulate my HTML text. So for that, I'm gonna use, we have these two div tags. One says hello and says the logout button. We wanna show this when user is logged in, and we wanna show this when user is logged out. For that, I'm gonna add authorize view, and in authorized view, I can use authorized tag, and I can also use not authorized tag. Nice. So we would like to put this div tag in authorized because user is logged in. I'm gonna make it look a little nicer. And instead of showing hello email address and username, I would like to actually show the email address of the user. So I'm gonna say context user identity and name, so that we could get the email address that we stored, in the claims type name. And just like we added this HTML in authorized tag, I want to add this HTML in not authorized tag so that it shows this HTML when user is not logged in. Let's run this and see how this looks. So I'm going to stop the server and rerun it. I'm going to press F12 before I refresh my page. And here in application cookies, I don't have any cookies. If I refresh the page, I don't have any cookies. And when I refresh the page, you could see that the email address and logout button went away. And now I'm going to click on this login button. That's going to add the cookie in my application cookies. And it also shows this hello John Smith at gmail.com here. So we could show this piece of HTML when user is logged in, and this was showing when user was logged out. Now what I want to do, I want to call logout. Whenever this button logout gets clicked, I want to call the logout web API from our user controller so that we could log out the user and login and logout would work together. For that, I'm gonna go to my main layout, and this logout button is calling logout user, and it's not really doing anything, it's just going to the home screen. So I'm gonna inject HTTP client so that I could call that web API. I'm gonna say HTTP client underscore HTTP client, and then in my logout user, I'm gonna call that logout web API, this logout web API, so that I can sign out the user on the server side, and I'm gonna reload my app so that I could get the current state of the user from the server side. So I'm gonna call that web API. I'm gonna say HTTP client get async. I can just say get async. I don't really have to use from JSON and anything. So I'm gonna say user logout user. We would like to add an await keyword here and make this async task so that it could wait for this user to log out, and then it will reload our page. Let's run this and see if that works or not. So currently user is logged in because I could see the cookie. Even if I refresh the page, the cookie stays. I'm gonna click on this logout button, and that's gonna remove the cookie from my browser, and it's gonna throw me on the login page where the user is not logged out. So this is how you can sync up with your server's authentication state by calling these login methods, logout methods, and get current user web API calls. In the next section, I'm going to test some other users in my system to see if they're working fine or not. And I'm also going to show where you can find this code and what you can do if you get stuck. To test with some other users, I'm going to go to my SQLite Explorer and open my users table. Let's try to log in with Julius Caesar and see what happens. So I'm going to copy his email address and his password and try to log in. We get logged in with Julius Caesar. Let's try to log in with Gary Thomas. I'm going to copy his email address and his password, and we get logged in with Gary Thomas. Even we're getting signed in with Gary Thomas, we see John Smith's profile. So we need to change that in the next episode. Also, if I try to log in with some invalid data, it gets navigated to the profile page. It doesn't get logged in by any user, but we do get navigated to the profile page. We need to add validation on the login page so that we stay on the login page if it's an invalid user. Also, I'm going to encrypt this password because no one stores passwords in plain text. So we're going to change that in the next episode too. If you get stuck doing this, I suggest that you should compare your code with the episode 11th code because this is the 11th episode of the series. And if you're typing along with this video series, then I suggest that you should compare the code with episode 10 and episode 11. Then you'll find out what you're missing. Also, if you have any questions, you can always ask them in the comment section of this channel, or you can reach out to me on Twitter or Facebook. With that, I'm going to end this video. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you in the next one.